Okay, we might kick off proceedings today. Welcome everybody, and I know that people will join us along the way. Anyone that's been with us for the last few minutes, I hope you've enjoyed the conversation about our love of dogs. I guess that gives a real insight into the panelists that are with us today. Great to have dog lovers with us today for sure. So thanks everyone for joining us again. This is actually the second webinar that we've run relating to the findings and the recommendations that have come from the Victorian Royal Commission into the Victorian health system, and with a particular focus on how this applies to our farming community. So we ran an initial webinar in July, which was really successful, and we had so many questions generated following a presentation from Matthew Hercus and questions with our panel that we decided we'd run another event. So it's taken us a little while to get up and going. We've had a couple of interruptions relating to COVID, but we are back with you today, and really very, very pleased to be able to welcome our panelists today. So with us, we have Kelly Barnes, who's our lived experience representative. Kelly was with us for our first panel, and it's great for her to be back joining us for this second webinar. And we also have Dr. Dom Baetens from the Department of Health joining us today for Q&A. Welcome, Dom. I'm not going to read out your bios today. I'm really happy just to hand it across to you and allow you to introduce yourselves and what brings you to the panel today. So maybe, Dom, we could start with you.
Thank you very much, Shelley. So my name's Dom Baetens. I'm one of the Deputy Chief Psychiatrists working at the Department of Health. I also live in regional Victoria, and I work as a psychiatrist in a rural community, just one day a week, but providing a service there. I've also got a particular interest in this area as my son's actually just completed his Bachelor of Agricultural Sciences and is looking to come to work in farming and agriculture eventually.
Fantastic. That's a great connection there, Dom. And it may be a really strong ongoing connection for us and the National Centre for Farmer Health to connect with you more frequently. So that's fantastic. Thanks for coming today. And Kelly, I'll pass it over to you to introduce yourself too.
Thanks, Hallie. So I'm Kelly Barnes. I was the AgriFuture's Rural Women's Award winner for 2020. That's a bit of a mouthful, that one, for my working dog project, tying in mental health with farmers. And so hence my love of dogs. I think that working dogs can really bring a lot of benefits to farmers. So I grew up in the UK and I've been living here in Dunkeld. Actually, it's just clocked over 10 years since I had my permanent residency. So that was at the beginning of November. So yeah, I've been here, I've worked on farm and then more recently in sort of agribusiness roles due to chronic pain. So, and I attended the information session they had in Hamilton here for the Royal Commission.
Great, thanks, Kelly. And also, you know, we're very pleased at the National Centre for Farmer Health that Kelly's come along to join us to work with us a couple of days a week at the moment, as we're working on an evaluation of 11 resilience programs that are just up and running across Victoria. So focusing on building resilience in agriculture dependent communities. So that's a really exciting new project that we're involved with, and very pleased to have Kelly supporting us with that as well, in addition to today's webinar. And so you may all remember that with the previous webinar, we focused on a presentation about the findings and the recommendations from the Royal Commission that Matthew Hercus was, we were very pleased to have him present that to us. And then we did have some questions at that event. But today's focus really is on delving more deeply into those questions and the answers from our panel. So I actually have a list of questions that came out of the last webinar that I'll be running through today, but please do feel free, anyone, to pop your questions into the Q&A section of the webinar, and we'll endeavour to get to those as part of today's presentation today. But I'll start with a question, Dom, for you. So the recommendations describe the development of 8 regional mental health and wellbeing services. How will the location of these services be decided? Will it be based on servicing larger regional centres, or will it also consider where strong service models already exist? So locations, I guess, that have already been successful in attracting and retaining mental health professionals, even if they're not the biggest population centres.
So the Royal Commission has been really ambitious in its vision around mental health and well-being for Victorians. And when it speaks to developing these 8 regional areas, it's not just thinking about mental health services as such, but it's thinking about aligning the boundaries between different services to try to really synergize and bring together the different service types that will help to optimize people's mental health needs and well-being needs. So not just around where there's been effective treatment service provision, but thinking about how do boundaries line up so that we can provide the structure within which we can then look to really support and strengthen some of those existing successful service providers. Each regional area will then have a local mental health and well-being services, and each of those services will cover about 100,000 adults and older adults within, and then we come down to the actual services and the community's opportunities through the regional boards to make decisions about which services they want to commission to provide and to service the needs of their communities.
Thanks, Dom. And I guess that it's great to see that recognition of all of the different aspects that contribute to mental health and wellbeing, not just those professional services or professional mental health supports, but also things like housing, employment, all of those kind of different things, which we do know are really strong contributors to wellbeing.
It's absolutely, it's coming into a recognition of that mental health can't be separated from other determinants of health, particularly the social determinants of health, employment, housing, connection for communities.
Great, fantastic, thank you. Kelly, I think this next question is probably for you. Do you think that community-led programs, such as raising awareness of local services through community events, resilience or mental health training, or bringing local people together to talk about mental health, make a difference in smaller rural communities?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Ali. Absolutely, I do. I think that the response from people tends to be a lot better when it's coming from peers, so coming from someone else within their community. I think there's always that sort of looking over the gate aspect, seeing what other people are doing. So if your neighbour happens to say to you, oh, I was having a bit of a rough time and I actually went and, I found this this really good service and went and spoke to them, they were great. I think that would encourage someone else to go as well. And the mental health training, I think, is really important doing. I think if you can get a group of people together in that local community that are on the same page and they've learned how to identify mental health issues and things like that, I think they can come together to provide support. And I think just any of that general, like getting people together in community events and getting that social connection is really, really important.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. We've got a question from David in the chat, and I think it actually relates to the previous question, Dom, around the regional mental health and wellbeing services. David's asking where, for example, would Hamilton fit in? So I guess that's that idea that there would be, if we're looking at regions that cover approximately 100,000 people, Hamilton would not necessarily, given that we have around about 10,000 people, would be brought together, I'm assuming, with other towns in the region.
Yes, it would be, but there might be within, so the Hamilton area specifically may have services that are Hamilton specific and really targeted to what people in the Hamilton community feel is beneficial to them. But then it will connect to those that 100,000 population mental health and wellbeing service to provide further kind of tiers of support or increasing tiers of specialist support as needed, that people in the local community can hopefully much more readily, because I'm actually acutely aware of some challenges that there have been in the Hamilton community around accessing specialist services, but hopefully you'll have those connections to really link into the specialist services if and when you need them, and at that time, not in days or weeks or months.
And yeah, it just sounds from your answer there too that there will be a lot of consultation with community about their actual service needs as well. So it's not necessarily going to be the same one size fits all across the different regions, very much focused on the needs within that region.
Yeah, absolutely, and on what can be provided in that region and what's wanted by the community in that region.
Terrific. This is another one, I think, for you, Dom, for the moment, and then there's a sort of a different aspect that will come to you, Kelly, for. But the question is, community members with lived experience, so that's lived experience of life or work in a farming community, as well as lived experience of poor mental health, can be great providers of mental health support in farming communities. However, people with lived experience don't always have the formal training or skills to deliver this support, even if they would like to. Will the rollout of Royal Commission recommendations assist with building skills in those with lived experience? That one's for you first, Dom, and then we'll go across to Kelly.
So the Royal Commission's absolutely recognised the central role of people with lived experience, and they are to be supported and embedded at all levels of the new service system. There will also be a new agency led by people with lived experience, which will help to establish organisations and support them in developing their lived experience workforce over time through accredited training and learning opportunities. I also anticipate that those that lived experience agency will become a way to develop lived experience networks. Because I think for any of us, lived experience or otherwise, working in this area, one of the things which supports and sustains our resilience is actually our networks, and particularly for people working and living in rural, regional and remote areas, you need those connections to sustain yourself so that you can also then sustain your community.
Fantastic, thanks. And Kelly, we know that you've already drawn on your lived experience to help support mental health in regional and rural communities. What formal training or support would help to extend your work?
Interesting. So I've done like the mental health first aid course and the HMF 701, HMF 702, which is run by the National Centre of Farmer Health. So that's given me a kind of a good basic understanding. I think for me, some of that project coordination, so like kind of more business orientated skills such as like project management, program coordination, that kind of thing, to really, I think you can have an idea, but it's very hard to pull it together sometimes. And you've got experience and some really good sort of assets on that side, but you don't always have the business side of it to then make that happen. So some of that more businessy support for me. Probably one of the things that really helped me the most was doing the leadership program with the Leadership Great South Coast. So I guess for other people and for me, sort of furthering on from that, so continuing on that leadership learning and understanding different leadership styles and things like that would be really good. But I think for other people as well, coming in, some of those leadership programs are really, really valuable, just to help you sort of get you a foot in the door and get you heading in the right direction. And that kind of covers off everything, like business wise and personally as well. So yeah, some of the, sort of for me, further development in that area, that leadership and that kind of coaching and business development stuff.
It's really interesting, I think, to see the different range of skills that you see as important for furthering your lived experience work too, Kelly. It's not just what we would naturally assume when we're supporting people with lived experience to do work in their community. So about their own, managing their own well-being and how to have conversations and all of that. It's all of the practical kind of skills and the project management skills that you're talking about that are also really important and possibly not something that we always would be thinking about. So really interesting to see that.
And it was an interesting question, because I think when you have lived experience, you kind of got the experience and the sort of knowledge behind you to, from your own experience or from helping other people, but you don't then know how to progress that to anything useful for sort of moving forward. So some of that, that project management stuff then turns your what you know and your knowledge and your ideas into something that can actually be successful.
Really supercharge that experience so that you can genuinely take up those leadership opportunities, and that as a leader, not just as someone providing consultation input.
That's right. And I think there's a really, something I've been thinking about recently, there's a really interesting thing around that leadership. I think we classically look at leaders as being these very outspoken, big voices, very, go-getters, really, really kicking goals. And I think when you've had experience with mental illness, or when you sort of struggle with lack of confidence and things like that, you probably don't look at yourself as a leader. But there's this whole other level of what I'd sort of call quiet or silent leadership, where you're not that big out in your face type person, but you can have a real impact on people. So, and that's probably where sort of having some of those skills outside of outside of your mental health knowledge really come in, because you really need to sort of tune in and acknowledge that you've got some really good skills to use, that you don't have to and that's same with that leadership training. You don't have to lead in that one way that does tend to come across quite strongly in all leadership sort of channels.
I think too, though, Kelly, that's where probably we as professionals or clinicians have learning to do, how to create the space for those quieter voices to shine through. How do we create the opportunities and the conditions in which that's possible, if we're going to genuinely draw on people's experience to develop and to deliver innovation.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I think with the big focus on lived experience that's come out of the Royal Commission, it's also about kind of empowering people to recognise that they have the capacity and the skills and the lived experience to bring things to the community, and where they may not feel them that they are kind of natural leaders. We need to kind of explain to them or communicate that that silent, as Kelly referred to it, that silent or quiet leadership is just as important as those who are the louder voices in the room as well. So make that opportunity open to everyone.
I think, yeah, with that too, Ali, I think sometimes when you do have mental illness or sort of that lack of confidence, you almost don't want to go out there and do all these things because there are times when you can't do it. So that's a very difficult thing to manage. You know, you get this platform and you're out there doing all this amazing work, and then you do have your ups and downs. Like there are times when you're perhaps not, you know, you're not able to go and be that at the forefront, and it's, I guess, supporting people to understand that that's okay too, and how they navigate through that. So if they do have a downtime or, you know, a bit of an off time and they need to withdraw, that's okay, and how do they, you know, they can put things in place to keep things running while they have that. So having that flexibility, and I think that probably puts a lot of people off a lot of the time, because you just think, you know, once you get out there, you think you've got to be this person that's on the whole time, and you don't. So
no, and actually the fact that you don't, and that we can find ways of making it okay to not always be okay, is better for all of us.
Absolutely.
None of us are okay all of the time. You know, sometimes we just cover that up and then suddenly we disappear from a role instead of continuing to be able to contribute. And I think actually working and acknowledging those needs for people with lived experience may make it easier for the rest of us to acknowledge those needs for ourselves as well.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Tom.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I'm really excited to see all of that work in the lived experience space start developing, because I think, you know, we've seen the huge value that lived experience brings, and to incorporate that in all of the work coming out of the Royal Commission is really, it's very exciting to see that happening. So the next question, which will be for you, Dom, is around digital and online services. And I know that that's always been a challenge and continues to be a challenge in our rural areas. So poor or lack of connectivity continues to be a problem more often in rural areas. Often people don't have access to suitable equipment to take advantage of the services. And, you know, it's not the type of thing that people would necessarily want to be doing at the local library. And also they often don't have the digital literacy or the skills to access services online. So how will implementing the recommendations of the Royal Commission work with other government departments or service providers to support improved digital access for farming communities wishing to engage with digital mental health services? Has there been any thought to supporting skills development to lift digital skills for individuals?
A big question.
Big question, sorry. Could have probably been 10 questions.
I don't think we've quite nailed this one yet. I think this is a work in progress, but I think that's okay too in terms of some of the Royal Commission's recommendations. We know that some of the recommendations are going to take us some time to put into practice. There's also a piece of work here around how the state and Commonwealth governments work together to provide the infrastructure which is needed not just in Victoria, but, you know, for rural, regional, remote communities across Australia. So Infrastructure Australia at the Australian government level has recognised that digital infrastructure is a social infrastructure need. But as far as we've been able to tell, there is still some way to go in terms of stepping through, well, what's going to be needed to really deliver that infrastructure to rural and remote communities. In the Royal Commission's recommendations, the suggestion has been that there'll be 2 pilot sites, to digital pilot sites, to try to work through some of the challenges around digital service delivery, infrastructure, training, digital literacy, and that those pilot sites will need to also consider the lack of access for certain communities and populations. What is being suggested at the moment, and what has happened to a degree, and you know, we do it in the community where I work, is that some of the, not necessarily the regional, but the rural settings may host spaces which will facilitate digital access if a person isn't able to have it in the area where they actually live. Now, that's not an ideal solution yet. It's better than the library, because it will be private and it will be supported, and there may be some other benefits if it's co-located with other social services, for instance. But those are the types of solutions that are being looked at the moment. COVID has certainly pushed us towards the digital and telehealth space, and I think we've found ourselves using, well, really any means to try to support that. Sometimes it's been video telehealth, sometimes it's been telephone services, which are less ideal. I also think we really need to try to optimize the platform so that they're as easy as they possibly can be to use and as intuitive as they can be to use. And perhaps there's work to be done around the level at which we start to work on the digital literacy. Yes, we need to do catch up for some of our populations who are not digitally literate, but we also need to build and support the development of digital literacy through our schools and early on. Like looking at my kids, that they have a bit of a head start. Yeah.
Definitely. And thanks, Dom. And I guess, like in talking about the increased access to things like telehealth, that necessarily, I guess, would lead to people having exposure to perhaps a wider range of service providers, and not people only from, or service providers only from rural areas. So just thinking from a National Centre for Farmer Health perspective, that would be really important in that case, to make sure that whoever is delivering mental health services via telehealth is actually culturally aware, I guess, of life and work within our rural farming communities, to be able to deliver support that is actually tailored to the needs of those communities as well. So there's an added education component and awareness component for service providers, to make sure that the relationships that are developed via telehealth are really meaningful.
Yeah, I think that's still something to be further explored and developed, Alison. There are some really great innovative services already. For instance, there's the rural women's mental health service provided through the Alfred and Monash as a joint initiative, which prioritizes telehealth access for women in rural communities. And you can really access the specialist, high-level, innovative support and consultation very quickly. But there is the learning for those specialist services about the contexts to which they're providing supports as well. So it's a bidirectional need, which needs to be worked through.
Absolutely. So again, I think this next question here, we'll start with you answering, Dom, and then I'll ask for you to comment also, Kelly, from the perspective of us being a service provider of ag services yourself. So service providers in farming communities already have strong business relationships and possibly already have awareness of who might be experiencing mental health challenges in the community. So Dom, what are your thoughts, based on the recommendations from the Royal Commission, on training service providers? So that could be agronomists or fuel agencies, stock agents, all of those, to support mental health in their community, and how would this be most effective?
I think this is an area where we're going to need to draw on those local communities and those potential service providers to help to work out what they need in relation to training and what they want. Those communities already provide so much. And to a degree, we also need to support them in having the confidence around the excellence of what they provide already, but then maybe the opportunity to have further training and perhaps not more than that, but to perhaps be linked in and networked to contacts within the community that can then help them to link to more acute services if it's needed, or if they need support beyond the support that they're already providing the community, and saying, hey, it's a little bit beyond my skill mix. This needs some specialist support, but that they should have someone already identified within their community that they can go to, that can then link, whoever they're providing the support to other services. And we do have some examples of that type of wellbeing network that the government's recently established wellbeing networks between area mental health services, for child and adolescent services, and schools and other local service providers to help to pick up where there's an identified additional need. But Kelly, what would your thoughts be in terms of this area and the opportunities that are there?
This has to be probably one of my most favourite topics, Dom. I'm glad someone put this in. So I've worked in rural merchandise and other sort of ag roles, and there's this huge potential there to upskill all of those, like stock agents, agronomists and things. I also think we don't realise how much pressure they are under. So if I use an agronomist as an example, they're out on farm, they're going on farm. So a lot of people that wouldn't, if they're struggling, they're not coming into town, they're not leaving their sort of area. So they're hitting those people. Seasonal variation, so they might have 50 clients, and in a tough year, each of those 50 clients is feeding back their problems to this one central person. So they're going out on farm, they're getting to people that probably don't see anyone very often, they're withdrawing anyway because they're having a tough time. And then they're out there looking at crops, and they spend a lot of time, they might be in the ute with the client for 2 hours, and they're offloading every single thing in the world and more, and they don't have the skills to do it. They're trained in agronomy, they're trained at looking at plants and knowing different chemical applications, and they're often that very sort of task focused type person. They work on their own, so they have to be that very individual type person, and they don't have those basic skills. So I think there's a huge potential, and because of the reach too, and the same with, say, fuel agencies, stock agents, they're going on farm, so the people that they're coming in contact with are the people that have withdrawn. So they're the people that are very isolated. So they're meeting them in their own environment. So they're often a lot more comfortable on farm. There's a classic sort of behaviour thing with men that if you sit side by side, they talk better, and that's exactly what they do. They get in the ute with them, or they sit in the buggy with them, and they're sat side by side. So there's this perfect environment for them to open up to this person, but the poor person going out there hasn't got that skills or that training. And they're also they're very susceptible to that vicarious trauma, because they're taking on the load of 50 different people, all in a drought year or a flood or a frost year. They're taking that from 50 different people, all telling them the same thing in a different way, and then there's no one there supporting them. So I think there's a huge area of work that can be done in that with those people. And I think there's that two-pronged attack, like training them to deal with the farmers, but also supporting them to prevent them from going down that path too, because they may, outside of work, and it's a very like it's a very full-on role. Like those kind of stock agents, agronomists, they're on call 24 hours a day basically. They don't switch off and they don't have that downtime. So I think there's a real potential there to really help them manage their own mental well-being as well, and also teach them to deal with, and it's not like you say, it's not, they're not going to become a psychologist, but they just know how to pick up on the signs and to give someone some resources of where to get help, or if you're really concerned, obviously you can call the police and do check-ins and things like that. So yeah, I'm very passionate about that area, just from observing and looking at the personalities that, the people in those roles are very task focused people, but I think it's very confronting for them when they come across that situation.
I think that speaks really, that just links in with your mentioning of the development of those networks, Dom, for those people to recognize that they have a whole network that they can actually reach out to, and is really important, because I think often those service providers don't necessarily recognize the value that they can have just by having a conversation. They think that they need to have counseling skills, and it's not necessarily the case that those are the sorts of skills that are required. Is that it's often just being able to kind of have a conversation, and then to be able to refer on to other supports within that network that they can tap into.
Yeah, but also, sorry, Kelly.
You go, Dom.
To recognize what you were saying about, how the vicarious trauma that can come with that potentially for the person in that role. You can have a sense of helplessness when you're trying to carry the load of what people are sharing with you, and you don't know where to go, and you don't know how to take the next few steps, or you don't know what is reasonably something that you can carry and something reasonably that you need to hand on. So absolutely those skills, and then those connections and those networks.
I think it's something that we need to start including, like, you say your son's at agricultural college, that's something he needs to learn, as well as how to identify plant growth stages. Like it's something that we can start incorporating in their learning, and then it becomes a normal conversation. And the same with, I've done sales training and I've done different product training and things like that. And it's just something that we need to add on to that training. And when you're doing your agronomy training, that becomes, part of the training, because you do get taught how to deal with different people and how to have, salesy type conversations, but how, teach them as well to have those conversations. And like you say, know when you're becoming affected and where to draw the line and how to deal with that as well. And just make it, it becomes part of your training as a stock agent or as an agronomist, or
And it links into, doesn't it, into a number of opportunities around prevention in terms of sort of, social connection, primary prevention, but that secondary prevention, early intervention opportunities, but having people introduced to those ideas at a kind of pre-vocational level when they're in training, even in training which appears to be unrelated, but we're all going to be dealing with humans in the end, and we're going to come across people who have challenges and mental health challenges.
Yeah, and I think that it's inevitable. Like in something like anything to do with agriculture, it's so unpredictable that at some point in your career you're going to have a flood or a drought, or like the dairy crisis. There is going to be something, you're guaranteed pretty much, whatever role you go into as a service provider. So it's just learning to deal with that.
That's actually a beautiful segue into our next question, which is prevention focused. So there is a tendency to focus our efforts on supporting people who are already experiencing poor mental health. And obviously we've discussed the real importance and the challenges associated with that so far. And that kind of support-focused approach is encouraged by campaigns like Are You OK? And programs delivered by Beyond Blue. So while a focus on improving support is very important, what Royal Commission recommendations focus on prevention? So putting strategies in place to stop people getting to a point where they need that crisis support.
So I think that the Royal Commission, and you're right, it does segue from our last. The Royal Commission has recognised that mental illness prevention needs to be quite broad, and it needs to address the determinants of mental health and of health more broadly, and to think about the different layers of prevention, the primary population-based interventions which we've been talking about, and secondary prevention opportunities, the screening and so on. So it's looked at possible opportunities like parenting programs, social and emotional development programs, supportive environments, community actions, actually some of the things which we're talking about right at the moment. And it's also put in place or recommended a structure which will hopefully help community and government focus on the prevention part, so that there will be a dedicated funding for prevention, and there will be an agency which is dedicated to mental health well-being and prevention, and that will feed up through the layers of government to an interdepartmental committee on mental health and wellbeing promotion, which will be co-chaired by the Department of Premier and Cabinet alongside the Department of Health. Now, you know, when I'm talking about that, it feels like I'm talking about, and I am obviously talking about, layers of bureaucracy and government, and kind of, you know, how far away from the real world are we? But I think that the idea of this is to actually genuinely say, hey, you know, mental health and well-being, mental illness prevention is not the responsibility of just an individual department, not even the Department of Health. It's something which needs to be owned by whole of government, because it has all these other aspects connected to it. It has a need for good social policy. It has a need for thinking about what's happening on farms, what's happening with climate, with all kinds of things. And so structurally, I think the Royal Commission has tried to address that as well, to say, hey guys, this is for all of us. Let's tackle it together.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Kelly, so with the value, I guess, of your own lived experience, are there strategies or resources that you think could have helped prevent you from experiencing poor mental health, or things that you have actually found helpful for preventing, I guess, the challenges that go along with having a lived experience of poor mental health?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think preventing you sometimes, almost for me, like I don't think I realized that I had things that were affecting my mental health until I'd got to a point where I had to go and seek help. So I think there probably wasn't anything for me to, like, I would not have gone and got, you know, done some of these preventative strategies because I wasn't really aware. And it's probably, if I look back, it probably stems back quite a long way. So I wouldn't have been aware that I needed to go and do some of these things. So I think it's almost, you know, like you look for the good in everything, but you've got to go through it sometimes, I think, to realize what's going on and then work it through from there. So I guess for me, like I'd never have prevented that. And I think I'm just, being a more sensitive person, I'm just more susceptible to poor mental health in that way. But I guess, yeah, sometimes it's really hard. I think the resources are there a lot of the time, but you don't want you either don't want to go to use them, or you don't realize you need to use them, or you just sometimes can't access them and life gets busy, and that tends to be the thing that you put off all the time. So I guess just having more availability, like on the spur of the moment. I think sometimes when you're in that mindset and you're like, right, I've got an hour, I need to go and do something about that, then that's where the barriers come up with, having an appointment in 6 weeks' time. Well, by then you kind of feel a bit better and you've forgotten about it and you've moved on, or the other way. So it's just having access to sort of quick, instant things, I suppose, that can start you on that chain of events. Probably just more awareness, I think, for me, and that's exactly what we're talking about, just including it in everyday conversations, making people aware that feeling a certain way could potentially lead to other things, or having more understanding about the symptoms and things like that. And just it's a really interesting one. I find it really hard because I think a lot of the time, it's only once you've gone through it that you really start to learn more about it, and then you understand, and then retrospectively you look back and think, oh, well, now I realise that, back then 10 years ago, I probably should have done this, that and the other. But you need to go through that learning process to get to where you are as well. So just building that awareness and sort of having the resources there if you need them, and having that quick access to start the ball rolling, and that continuity, I suppose. But it's a very difficult question, I think, because a lot of the time we won't go and get help either. And there's so many things sort of blocking that. It's not one thing or another.
Yeah, and we're not always recognizing before we become, we get all these multiple hits that build up over time, but we're kind of okay for so long, until we fall off the cliff. And while we're kind of okay, it's really hard to recognize the need to pay attention to some of the basics that might actually help us from, or prevent us from getting to that cliff. And I also don't think we were particularly good at I don't think we're particularly good at doing it for ourselves, or at teaching or supporting our young people in developing the types of habits and structures that will help that either. So yeah,
it's so complex too, because every single person's different. The way they cope with it is different. Their triggers are different, their signs are different. So someone that's quite happy being on their own and with their own company, well, for them to withdraw, that's the safety, that's them doing their self-care. Whereas for someone else that's normally out and about, it's obvious when they withdraw, but there's so many complexities with different personalities and things like that. I think you're right. You do almost have to almost kind of go through it once to then realize your own triggers, and then build up from there, which sounds a bit counterproductive. But I do think you've kind of got to go through it a little bit to learn where your triggers are.
Or maybe that's part of the idea, that we somehow help people to learn around micro stress exposures, without getting extreme. That, hey, you have a micro experience. Yeah. And this is what helps, and I don't know. It's
I guess it's also, like Dom, you mentioned, and I know that Kelly, you're very aware of this as well, that it's often about kind of focusing on the basics. Sometimes I think we expect to require something really complicated, something difficult to achieve. But if we're focusing on just those basic things in our life, that can have such a bearing on preventing risks from mental health. And I'm thinking about things like good eating, good sleep patterns, keeping socially connected, making sure we do things that we enjoy, physical activity. Just so a lot of those basic things can really be very strongly contributing to the prevention of poor mental health as well. But we forget that.
Absolutely. And
sorry.
No, Kelly.
We like to push the boundaries too sometimes, and I think we're all just like a little bit rebellious, and oh, well, if, I know I should be eating this way and doing this and doing that, but, I feel all right, so then I'll stop doing that a little bit. And then you're almost seeing how far you can push it. So, yeah, I think that's the trouble. You know all the things you should do, but you just have to test the boundaries sometimes, I think, and see if it's really true.
And let's face it, some of those basics are not terribly sexy, are they? A decent amount of sleep's extraordinary. Sleep is absolutely extraordinary. It reduces, getting enough sleep, it's going to reduce your risks of hypertension, your risk of cardiovascular disease, your risk of diabetes, your risk of your risk of suicidality just goes through the roof when you haven't slept. But saying to them, go to bed at the same time, wake up at the same time, get those 8 hours it's not the most exciting intervention, even if it's an absolutely crucial one.
Yep, for sure. Really interesting to have these conversations. It's great. Kelly, no, I've already asked you that one. I'm moving on to the next one. So Dom, during their community consultations, the commissioners were very interested in the case management approach of the AgriSafe program. That's great. I'm really pleased a question was raised about this, because it is one of the National Centre for Farmer Health programs. So I didn't put the question in myself. So AgriSafe focuses on physical and mental health in a holistic and ongoing way that is tailored to the needs of farmers. Would there be potential for funding provision to broaden this service across rural Victoria? So, for example, in bush nursing centres, rather than a fly-in, fly-out service that might be provided at this time?
So I think the answer to this is yes and no. Absolutely, these kinds of integrated programs are actually what we'd ideally want to see coming on board. And the regional boards will have the opportunity to think about, what services do they commission to meet their community's needs. And if they then look at their community's needs and they see that there is a program such as this which would really fit in, then absolutely they can make use of that kind of program and tailor it to their local community. But it will depend on what the community consultations say and how they inform what the regional boards will look to commission for the communities. But I think this is exactly the type of service that we're more likely to see introduced. But it won't be kind of rolled out from a central point, as in, the tower in Lonsdale Street says you will now have X in every community in Victoria. It will be through those regional boards saying our community wants to deliver particular services to address particular needs, and there will be kind of a capability framework. The boards will need to deliver certain types of services, but the boards will then be able to say, and in our community, this is how we choose to meet those needs. This is what works for us.
So with that capability framework, Dom, is that trying to kind of balance the evidence base for what works with the requests from community about what they would like in their region?
So the capability frameworks are also looking at trying to re-equilibrate and get kind of equity of access to a range of services. So that kind of say at this, at the level of the region, these are the range of services which every Victorian should expect to be able to access within their region. It might be delivered in different ways because different ways of delivery suit different communities, but these are the range of services that you'd expect to be able to access. Because at the moment, it's probably not that equal across the settings.
So I've just got a question come in that says, I've noticed that a lot of very rural and remote communities do not have government funded health services. How are the recommendations going to work with non-government services to support those more remote areas?
It would be really good to, I guess, have the specifics of that question, because it sounds like there's a specific community in the background of that. But there will be opportunities for there to be partnerships between non-government organisations, and there'll be likely funding flowing to non-government organisations which are able to deliver a service in a place where maybe there's less government coverage. Sometimes too, that the way in which the government delivers the services may not be fully visible even at present. There may be funding flowing through to some NGO services through government, even though they're not government services as such. So there will definitely be partnerships. In fact, there'll be a strong encouragement to develop those types of partnerships with NGOs and with private providers as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of what is successful in rural communities is really driven by those partnerships and those collaborations. And I know just from our own perspective here at the centre, we really, I guess, aspire to work very collaboratively with community, with the agricultural industry, as well as with health services and education. And that's the way that we find we get best connection and best reach, and are able to kind of deliver the most meaningful services. And it is around kind of building those partnerships and those collaborations.
And that's also where you get the opportunities, I think, for genuine innovation.
Absolutely. Kelly, do you have any more comment to make on any of that?
No, I think Dom's entirely correct with what she says. I think there's a lot of innovation in those private sectors, and even, just locally based in individuals doing what they're doing, and they often know what suits that particular community the best. So I think working, like you say, having some of that funding flow down and partnering with those private organisations is a really good opportunity to create change. I think it's quite often and not necessarily in those really remote communities, but I think in any community, having people on the ground that want to drive initiatives, they're driving them from for a reason. Like, they're driving them from a place that they have knowledge and they can see an idea that's going to work. So I think really partnering with those people that are already doing the work is going to be a great success.
Fantastic. Now I think there's one more question / comment around people being social animals. And I think it's speaking back to that idea that we spoke of, delivering telehealth and services digitally. And the comment here is that people are social animals. And I appreciate that being digital has come more to the fore because of COVID, but that it shouldn't be a fallback. It should be a fallback rather than being a first port of call. And I think we'd all agree today that the digital aspect is just one aspect of what is coming out of the Royal Commission. Do you have anything else to add to that, Dom?
I see the digital aspect at this stage as complementary and attempting to extend the reach of services rather than replacing face-to-face services that are there already, or that could be there, but an extension, not a replacement of.
I think too, Dom, there's always that demographic. I think we assume, because we like connecting with people that everyone does, but sometimes there are people that don't want to, and it's not, I talk about, people that are really introverted. It's not a bad thing that they don't want to be face to face all the time. That can be confronting, especially if they're not feeling great themselves. So I think I know I'm not a fan of digital meetings and things like that. I'm a big social connection person, but I also realize that not everyone is, and I think there is some really good benefits from doing it digitally. It's less confronting, or you don't have to take that time to travel and things like that. So I like the fact that it's complementary, and it's like another tool in the toolbox to add on. And I think we are all probably a bit Zoom fatigued over the last 2 years, and the mention of anything digital and everyone no, but and the same with COVID. There's people that have thrived during COVID because they work better with that, that digital interaction as opposed to face to face. So I sort of, it's definitely something that I think is going to work really well for some people.
And it's been extraordinary. It's funny that you say that, Kelly. On the clinician side of things, for me, for instance, normally, pre-COVID, I would always be seeing people face to face. Now I have seen them, in their living rooms, in their bedrooms. I've seen them with their families. I've seen them with their friends. I've seen them in ways that I would not have been able to see them before, and in ways that they possibly wouldn't have felt able to be seen before either. And they've probably seen me in ways that they wouldn't have either, or heard my dog. And there have been some opportunities for a different type of connection in that too, which I'm still coming to terms with. But it sometimes led me to think, gosh, I hadn't realized how stressful it was for you parenting. I hadn't appreciated the tensions in your home environment, or the leaks in your roof, or even if you may have told me about them before. Now I'm seeing them, and it means that I then experience a bit more pressure to try to do something about them.
Yeah, and I think, like, you're right. I think they are very different in a home environment. What they probably don't tell you about some of those things that are happening in the background, and then when you're zooming in live and they're there in the background, you can pick up on things. So it's a really interesting observation, I think.
So I guess the best way to look at that is that it expands our choices and allows us maybe to balance out the best way to interact and support people post-COVID, once we get a bit of balance back. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, both Dom and Kelly. It's been a fantastic conversation, and I've loved really having very much a sort of a conversational aspect to today, and still being able to answer all of those questions that were both posed at the previous webinar and that have been coming through in the chat and the Q&A sections today. So I really, really appreciate your time, and thanks very much to the audience for joining us. Just to remind you that this is being recorded, so we will be sharing it on the Farmer Health website as well. Great to have these conversations, and I look forward maybe to the opportunity for having future conversations on this topic, because I think it's something that we all want and need to be talking about and looking at solutions in what can be a very tricky space. But we can see from today, I think, that there are ways forward, and the recommendations and findings from the Royal Commission really have indicated that there are ways forward, and a hope for seeing this come to fruition. And it's quite an exciting time, I think, to be living in a rural community. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us.
And don't stop the conversations. Keep looking for those opportunities and inform the implementation of the Royal Commission's recommendations.
Great, Dom. Thank you. Kelly, any last comments from you?
No, I think I've said enough, Ali. But, thank you. Thank you for having me. And it was really, yeah, really nice to have that open conversation as opposed to a more formal structure. So no, it's been really good.
Great. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you so much, Alison. Lovely meeting you, Kelly.
Bye-bye.